News when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow.
Karen, we begin with the latest developments on global trade. President Donald Trump is threatening a 35% tariff on some Canadian goods, an increase from the current 25% rate that would take effect August 1st. But as Bloomberg's Bill Ferries reports, this increase would not affect goods under the terms of the current U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement.
That might be a little misleading as a headline number. I mean, our understanding of this is that it would not apply to products or goods and services that are already covered under this USMCA trade agreement with Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. So that's the majority of goods traded between the U.S. and Canada right there. So things like energy as well are subject to a lower 10% tariff. In terms of the 35%, I think we're going to need a lot more details from the White House before that goes into place about which products. But it doesn't look like that kind of broad swath of tariffs across everything that comes south from Canada.
Bloomberg's Bill Ferries reports President Trump's announcement on Canada came as he told NBC News he's also eyeing blanket tariffs of 15 to 20% on most trading partners.
Nathan, Vietnam is seeking to lower its tariff rate by the U.S. Sources say the country's leadership was caught off guard by President Trump's announcement last week of a 20% tariff. Vietnam is pushing for a tariff in the 10 to 15% range.
And Karen, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva says his country can survive without trade with the U.S. and will look to other partners to replace it. In a broadcast interview, Lula said Brazil's trade with the U.S. represents 1.7% of his country's GDP. And quoting here, it's not like we can't survive without the U.S. Earlier this week, President Trump threatened 50% tariffs against imports from Brazil.
Meanwhile, Nathan, tariffs on China remain in the spotlight this morning. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi in Malaysia. It marks the first in-person session between the two, and Rubio came away hopeful.
Very positive interaction, and constructive is the most important part. At the end of the day, look, no matter what, the United States and China have to have relations. We have to have communication. We have to be able to interact with one another. And it's just impossible for the foreign ministers of our respective countries to not engage in conversation. So I'm glad we had that meeting today. There's a lot of work to be done. No one's saying it's easy, but we do have some opportunities on some things we might be able to work on to begin to build some momentum in our relationship. I thought it was a very good meeting. I really felt encouraged by it. But look, there's work to be done.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio added that President Trump has a very positive relationship with President Xi and says the odds are high that there will be a presidential summit between Trump and Xi. Back in May, the U.S. and China agreed to temporarily slash their high tariffs imposed on each other.
Now, Karen, when it comes to the impact the tariffs will have on inflation, St. Louis Fed President Alberto Musalem says it's still too soon to tell. He spoke at an event in St. Louis yesterday.
The outlook for inflation that I have, and it's in accordance with what many private forecasters have, is for inflation to increase going forward, mostly owing to tariffs, which may settle somewhere between the low teens or the low 20s, depending on trade policy.
St. Louis Fed Chief Alberto Musalem says the tariff impact on inflation so far has been mild, but he expects it to show up more in the data starting in June, July, August, or September.
Nathan, President Trump says he plans to make a major statement on Russia on Monday. In an interview with NBC News, the president repeated his criticisms of Russian President Vladimir Putin over his continued attacks in Ukraine. He says he expects the Senate to pass a tougher sanctions bill sponsored by Republican Lindsey Graham, though it's his option whether to use it. And he says he's reached an agreement with NATO for allies to buy U.S. weapons that would then be sent to Ukraine.
Well, later today, Karen, President Trump's focus turns to the flood disaster in Texas. He does plan to visit Texas Hill Country today, where at least 120 people were killed in last weekend's flash floods and more than 170 are still missing. Fredericksburg, Texas Fire Marshal Reagan Rapke says more than 2,000 local, state, and federal workers are still searching for victims in Kerr County.
And we have heavy equipment working, and we're having to dig through it by hand as well. Just because the machines can go through it, we have to be very methodical about what we're doing.
It's Fredericksburg Fire Marshal Reagan Rapke. President Trump's expected to get an aerial tour of some of the hard-hit areas and meet with first responders and relatives of flood victims. Texas's 2 Republican senators are expected to join the president aboard Air Force One.
Nathan, let's turn to the markets where futures are lower as we close out the trading week. Yesterday, the S&P 500 closed at a record as it nears the 6,300 level. Veronica Willis is global investment strategist at Wells Fargo Bank.
The market's seen a really impressive rally from those lows earlier this year. Maybe has gotten a little bit ahead of itself. There's still some uncertainties related to trade. We've got, earnings season coming up, which could start to see some of those impacts around that uncertainty around prices and uncertainty around tariffs.
Wells Fargo Bank's Veronica Willis. The S&P 500 is up almost 7% so far this year. And that's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Karen Moscow.
I'm Nathan Hager, and this is Bloomberg.